It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. Tonight we're looking back at the year that was in North Carolina politics and looking ahead to what we're expecting in 2025. Joining me tonight are WRAL state government reporters Doran and Paul Specht. Thank you guys for being here tonight.
Thanks.
All right, so let's start with the 2024 election, of course. And, despite a convincing win by Donald Trump in the state, several Republicans at the statewide level couldn't quite catch his coattails, right? From the Council of State to the state Supreme Court to the legislative supermajority, I think it's fair to say Republicans could have had a better night than they did. What do you think happened?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Democrats actually increased the Council of State. Our 10 officials who make up the executive branch of government used to be 6 Republicans to 4 Democrats. Now it's going to be evenly split, 5-5. So Democrats actually made up some ground there despite Trump's win here. I think obviously a lot of it goes back to the race for governor and Josh Stein's just, almost historic margins in that race over Mark Robinson, his Republican opponent. I mean, he won by margins that we have not seen in a governor's race since the 1980s here in North Carolina. And that, obviously has to trickle down to other candidates as well.
Well, we also heard a lot from Democratic Party Chairwoman, Anderson Clayton, talking about the effort that they put in and that the Biden and Harris folks put into the state for a ground game. Do you think that paid off at all, Paul?
Oh, absolutely. And, it's also important to keep in mind that North Carolina has a history of ticket splitting in presidential elections, voting Republican at the top and then Democrats for some of the state offices, which is why in 2022, it was so disappointing for Democrats not to win a single statewide race. Obviously, that's a midterm election. It's not a general election, but still, that's part of the reason that Anderson Clayton was able to gain the leadership position within the Democratic Party. They felt in 2022 that their ground game wasn't as strong as it should have been, and that they should have won some of those judicial races. Obviously, there was a U.S. Senate race that they fell short on. And so I think if you look at the trends, especially in the presidential race, even though Trump won here, North Carolina didn't move to the right as much as the other swing states did. The only state that moved to the right less was Wisconsin. So I think that goes to show that the things that they did in the last 2 years, getting more organized, getting teams out there, did pay off.
What about, I think a lot of us were surprised that Don Davis actually survived this election. He was up against a well-funded challenger, somebody who looked like she had a good chance. The district was redrawn. How do you think he pulled it out?
Don Davis has voted moderate for basically his whole political career when he was in the state legislature, and now that he's in the U.S. House of Representatives. He has, roots in Eastern North Carolina that he spent a whole lot of money emphasizing in TV ads, saying, I'm from here, I get it, I grew up picking tobacco. And even though he's a Democrat, a lot of people who voted for Trump also voted for him because they liked that message. And they saw that, okay, this guy, he might be a Democrat, but he's not as liberal as some of the other national Democrats we see, and we connect with his story, and he managed to pull it out. Pretty convincing win in that competitive district that, like I said, voted for Trump, but Don Davis for U.S. House.
The only swing district in the whole state at this point.
Yep.
So interesting. I'm going to go back to Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. Gave us one of the most memorable races, I would say, in recent memory of governor's races, thanks to a bombshell CNN report that linked him to comments that were made on a pornography website many, many years ago. Paul, Robinson has sued over this story, saying that it's not true. How did CNN link him to the posts?
They put in their story a little bit of how they linked him, so people are free to go click on that article and see some of their explanations. But they looked at some of his social media accounts and the phrasings that he's used, and some of the account name, which it spells out what looks like the word mini soldier. To allege that, hey, this guy using a similar username on this porn site looks a lot like, the person who's been using this other site that was controlled by Mark Robinson, that site being his social media accounts, things like that. This case has not resolved yet, so we don't know how it'll play out, but it was convincing enough, CNN's story was convincing enough for the Republican Governors Association to just pull out completely. And that was a huge deal when it happened, because this governor's race in North Carolina was considered the most competitive in the country.
Wow. So, the margin of victory obviously was a lot larger than we have seen, as you mentioned. Do you think this was because of this story, or do you think perhaps Robinson was in trouble before this story?
It could definitely be both. Certainly a story like that does not help any politician's chances of winning an election. But we had already seen in polling, WRAL came out with a poll in March, more throughout the summer. All of them showed Stein leading this race. So Robinson was always the underdog when you looked at the polling, and it wasn't just our polling, it was plenty of other outlets as well had done similar polls that showed Stein with a big lead. But then this story comes out late in the election, September, and it just kind of felt like the nail in the coffin in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wonder because oftentimes in North Carolina, and this is something that Robinson's team pointed out, the Republican candidate for governor tends to poll lower than they actually perform on election day because Republicans tend to come home to the party, at the end of the day. And that just didn't happen this time.
Right. I think what you said was, I think, the best description, sort of the nail in the coffin. If we look back, President Trump himself, who has praised Mark Robinson on multiple occasions, he started distancing himself from Mark Robinson even before that CNN story came out. I believe they had not been sharing a stage together for, I think, almost a month until that CNN story came out. And then, of course, they didn't share a stage after that either. But leading up to that, the concern was that, Trump and Republicans, obviously all across the country, have been, and talking about abortion and being afraid of that messaging from the Democratic side. Well, Mark Robinson had several years of history of making very controversial statements about abortion and about women and why abortions happen and things like that. And so if we were to speculate, that's probably the biggest reason that Trump was distancing himself from Robinson even before the CNN article came out.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of our first segment here, so we're going to jump to a break very quickly. Please join us on the other side. We're going to talk a little bit more about what happened at the legislature, and there was plenty to talk about. Stay tuned. Welcome back to On the Record. If you're just joining us, we're looking back at 2024 in North Carolina politics and looking ahead to what this year might bring. I think we all have to agree that the story of the year, political or not, in North Carolina was Helene, right? And the damage and devastation that brought to Western North Carolina. 104 people lost their lives, deadliest storm in modern state history. Damage has been estimated upwards of $50 billion, right? How did this play out at the legislature, Will?
Well, when it first happened, we kind of saw this almost kumbaya moment. It was a unanimous vote to just quickly get back, pass some aid. Dozens of lawmakers came in from Raleigh, some of them kind of fighting their way to Raleigh through damaged or destroyed roads from Western North Carolina to get here, breaking down in tears when they were here in Raleigh, talking with us reporters about what they had seen and the need for state funding.
Yeah, some of them lost their own homes.
Exactly, and it was a very emotional time, and we get a lot of fighting at the legislature and a lot of personal digs at people a lot of times, but this was not the case with this. Both sides came together, really agreed that we need to do something, we need to do something fast, and they got it done. That kind of broke down a little bit later. There was, the next effort at a disaster relief bill that also, included some maybe politically motivated power grabs, as critics call them, and that really, got a lot nastier. But in the very immediate aftermath of the storm, we really did see our politicians come together and just say, hey, we need to do something about this right now.
It was very bipartisan. Yeah, it was at start, at first. Okay, so we know that we've got this really large, likely bill coming up for us, and we've heard legislators say that they're waiting for the feds to do something. In the meantime, we have people out in Western North Carolina saying, no, we need you to do it now. What does this mean, do you think, for the state budget?
Oh, gosh. State lawmakers have repeatedly said they can't do this alone. They've said that, from the start. The governor's office estimated the damage in Western North Carolina at initially $53 billion. I think that's up to about $58 billion now. And they've come out on the floor and said, we don't have it. We cannot do that. So they're relying on federal lawmakers to sort of bail them out. And we'll see how that goes. We've seen, people on both sides of the aisle go up to D.C. and lobby representatives from other states about spending bills that could help here. And they've said, this is going to be a multi-year cleanup and relief effort. And if you go out there, like some of our families have done over the holidays, it looks like a war zone. There are roads out, there are trees down everywhere. It's completely changed the landscape. Speaker Moore, who's now been elected to Congress, he says the same thing. There are buildings that you can't build back because the land has shifted underneath. So the lawmakers have talked about how this is going to be, the main topic for not just 2025, but for multiple years going forward.
Yeah, and I think we saw a little bit of that as we're, one of the first things that our new governor, Josh Stein, did after being sworn in on Wednesday was to go out to Asheville, right?
Exactly. Yes, he made a point of saying that this is the first thing that I am doing as governor, issuing an executive order for Helene relief. So he's going to keep this front of mind. Paul's exactly right. We're going to have to rely on the federal government for a lot of the aid. The main question here at the state level with the legislature is just going to be exactly how much do we spend and what areas do we prioritize? Do we give the money to people as grants? Do we give it as loans, especially for businesses that are receiving funding, expecting the state to get some of this investment back? And how quickly does it happen? We've seen obviously with other natural disasters here in recent years taking years for people to get their homes rebuilt. And, obviously the goal is to not have a repeat of that.
Yeah, it was a little ironic that just as this storm was hitting, we were still dealing with the aftermath of storms from 2016 and 2018, and I think most people would agree, the failure of Rebuild NC, which was created to use the federal money in those cases to rebuild people's homes, and really didn't get as much done as everybody thought that they were going to. So this does sort of leave the state and the Stein administration, I think, in a difficult position in terms of how they're going to respond to the rebuilding effort.
Yeah, that agency has been through a lot. Its leadership has been subpoenaed to come testify under oath in front of the state legislature about what they've done, what they haven't done. It's been, subject of, intense media analysis from us and others. Intense.
We've done a documentary on it, yeah.
Exactly. Intense political discussion at the legislature and, other parts of state government. And, we did see, Governor Cooper as head of the agency, resigning towards the end of his time as governor there, making way for new leadership under incoming Governor Josh Stein. So, how he's able to kind of turn that agency around and make it more efficient, faster is going to be an early test of his work as governor.
Right. We also saw some big changes this year to school vouchers, right? This was a deal that was in the offing all session, did not get done until they came back into town, and then it was enacted over the governor's veto. What was the rationale for opening up vouchers to all families, regardless of income, and what does that mean for the state budget?
My first impression was that for Republicans who support this initiative is that they think, your tax dollars should be able to follow your child. And so while they had this cap initially, they opened it up and they say to welcome more demand. And I think, if you hear them speak at the Capitol, they talk about constituents in their various districts who are seeking these vouchers but not getting them. And they say, it was pretty controversial though. Even some Republicans told us before the election that they were afraid that this could come back to bite them because in some more liberal parts of the state, including Wake County and Charlotte, some voters don't think that the money should be leaving public schools.
Well, and another thing that you've heard from some critics on that point is that a lot of these private schools that are getting the voucher funding that students are going to are in those urban areas, places like Raleigh and Charlotte, and there's not really as many private school options in the rural communities of North Carolina, which is where a lot of Republican politicians or Republican voters live. And so there's this kind of question of, okay, if you take some money out of the public school system because, as Paul said, the money follows the kid, then what happens to those rural communities? Is there maybe an unintended consequence here of targeting some of those schools? Republican lawmakers have said they're not worried about that they think, that school choice is going to be good on the whole, and more competition, obviously. The hope is that everyone gets better.
Yeah. In the meantime, also, and late in the year, the Republicans used their veto-proof majority one final time in a lame duck session to strip incoming Democrats, including incoming Governor Josh Stein, of power. Can you talk a little bit about what that bill did?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. It was, officially kind of promoted as a Helene relief aid, but had a little bit of Helene relief and a whole lot of other stuff in it. Yeah. And one of the main things was stripping control of elections administration away from the governor. That's something that the legislature has been trying to do for almost a decade, ever since Cooper first beat Pat McCrory back in 2016.
Right.
And so they keep losing in court. And then they tried proposing it as a constitutional amendment. Voters shot it down. So they've just had all of these efforts that have gone nowhere. They've got a new strategy this year to put it with the state auditor. Incoming Republican Dave Bullock is going to have control over elections administration unless a lawsuit that Cooper and Stein have already filed succeeds and ends up striking this down as well. So that is a big part of this.
Right, but it's interesting because the argument, of course, is that he's in the executive branch, so this maintains the separation of powers, right? But the court, a lot of people thought that when the Republicans had a 5-2 majority on the court, that they were going to be pretty much a rubber stamp for a lot of these cases that the legislature was sort of bringing to them in the form of laws that would be challenged by Democrats. We have not seen them take a lot of action on this particular issue. They've had this case before them for months now.
Yeah, the legislature actually tried to pass an even different version of changing up control of the elections board that Cooper sued over, and it was blocked by a judge. And the legislature asked the Supreme Court here to speed it up before this year's elections and let those changes that they wanted go into place before 2024. And the Supreme Court declined to do that. So you're right, that was an area that kind of surprised a lot of people who maybe had some assumptions about how the court would react to those challenges. Right. Obviously, the elections part is not the only part of this bill. There's plenty of changes targeting other Democratic officials who also won election in 24.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we're going to see more challenges because, this strips some powers away from incoming Mo Green, right? That's the state superintendent. Also, Jeff Jackson, our AG, our new AG. Do you think we're going to see additional challenges? Because those bills, I should explain for people, they have what's called severability clauses. So if one part of it gets challenged, the rest of it can still go into effect. And a lot of this stuff is still poised to go into effect.
Yeah, this is, over 130-page long bill. And, so if 4 pages out of it get ruled unconstitutional, that doesn't mean that the whole thing is unconstitutional.
Right.
And so, yeah, like you said, there are massive changes, especially with the Attorney General's office. And, I would be shocked if we did not see a lawsuit about that. As of right now, we have not, but I'm sure that's probably because the changes are so large and sweeping that it has taken them a while to
figure out how to frame it.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, that brings us to our second break, so please stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back on the record tonight with Doran and Paul Specht. Thank you, gentlemen. A look ahead into the unfinished business that's bringing us into 2025, the state Supreme Court race, right? Where does that stand at this point?
It is still tied up in court, like so many things in state politics seem to be these days. Democrat incumbent Allison Riggs initially appeared to have won by just a few hundred votes out of 5.5 million, a very tiny sliver. But Jefferson Griffin, the Republican challenger, has been fighting that, saying that there are around 60,000 voters' ballots who should not have been counted at all. And that is now in federal court for a judge to decide, and we are still awaiting that decision. So,
do we know, at this point, does Allison Riggs just continue to serve? Is that...
That is the impression, yes, okay, that she will be allowed to continue serving at least until this is all cleared up.
That is interesting. So in the meantime, as we mentioned, Republicans have put the state auditor, Dave Bullock, in charge of elections beginning in May. How might that affect how elections run in North Carolina? Are we expecting to see big changes to that?
Well, one area, if we're to speculate...
it is in court, but yeah, okay.
Right, well, one thing that's come up in Jefferson Griffin's challenge here is certain boards of elections allowing, say, dead people to vote, right? And so there's some legal gray area as to when, ballots should and shouldn't count. Some people cast their mail-in ballot, their absentee ballot, and then it goes in, it counts, but then they die before Election Day. And some people think that vote should be thrown out. Some people think that it should count. In this past election, we've seen it count. And so
well, in some counties.
In some counties, right, but not all. But just looking forward, at how might things change if there's a, Republican-controlled elections board. Maybe there's some sweeping policy that says you can't allow ballots to count if someone dies before Election Day. Things like that.
All right. Well, we had lots of changes at the legislature this year, most notably a new, what we presumptive House Speaker. They haven't had that vote yet, but this would be Destin Hall, who has been the Rules Chair under Tim Moore for some time. As you mentioned, Tim Moore now in Congress. And, Hall is coming in without the Republican supermajority in the chamber that his party enjoyed for the last couple of years. That means they're one vote away from being able to override a veto. What does that mean for Hall and for coming into this balance of power?
Well, it certainly doesn't make it easy on him. He's going to have to work, especially on controversial bills, to make sure that the whole GOP caucus is behind him if they want to be able to override a veto, and that they can maybe get one or two Democrats to come over as well. And we've seen there's a handful of Democrats in the legislature who are on the more moderate side and will vote with Republicans on maybe some socially conservative issues or some pro-business issues. It's a small number, but you do still have a few of those kind of moderate to conservative Democrats out there. Right. So he's going to have to definitely make some outreach to those folks.
We've seen, too, not just vote with them. There's some Democrats who are willing to not show up when there are key votes, and that can help them get the numbers they need, too.
It certainly can. All right, very quickly, of course, we're running out of time here, but we do have a new governor, of course, Josh Stein. What do we think about how he might navigate the legislature differently than how Cooper did? Do we know it?
That's a great question. Obviously Stein used to serve in the state Senate. He knows a lot of the people who are there. I imagine probably his strategies will be similar to Cooper's. Cooper had a reputation at times for, really coming down with a lot of pressure on Democrats to hold the party line. And, with only a one vote margin for that supermajority, we might see the same.
We might. And one last question, 2026, the Senate race, who's running?
I think everybody's watching to see if Roy Cooper will run. I mean, he's in his 60s, but he's maintained some really high favorability ratings. I know that Democrats think that he'd be a shoo-in for the nomination if he runs. And then, on the other side, Republicans are watching to see if anyone will primary Tom Tillis. Could that be Mark Robinson? Could it be someone else? Tillis had a primary opponent briefly in the 2020 election. So those are things we're watching to see.
That will be fascinating, and we'll be here to tell you all about it all year long, right? Well, that is it for tonight's On the Record. Thanks again to Will, Doran, and Paul Specht for joining me. Nice conversation, gentlemen. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can email us your comments, questions, or criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. And thanks again for watching.